The dust was a living thing. It coated Caleb Thorne's tongue, settled in the creases of his eyes, and clung to the sweat on his neck like a second skin. It was the first thing he tasted in the morning, and the last thing he scrubbed from his hands at night. His homestead was an island in a sea of grit and shimmering heat, a testament to a stubbornness that bordered on madness. The cabin, built of cottonwood he had felled and shaped himself, leaned into the perpetual wind as if tired of the fight. The barn was a skeleton of hope, housing a single stoic mule and a handful of scrawny chickens that seemed as weary of the sun as he was. Silence was his only constant companion, a presence so profound it had its own weight, pressing down on the cracked earth and the bruised purple sky of twilight. Caleb moved through his world with an economy born of solitude. There were no wasted steps, no superfluous gestures. His hands, broad and calloused, knew the language of wood, leather, and steel. They could soothe a spooked animal, set a fence post that would stand against a blizzard, and, in a life he fought daily to forget, draw and fire a pistol with a speed that defied the eye. He was a tall man, built of long muscle and bone that had been hardened, not broken, by a lifetime of hardship. His face was a road map of every one of those hardships, a terrain of sharp angles and sun-weathered lines. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. They were the eyes of a man who was perpetually watching his back trail, even when the only thing behind him was his own shadow stretching long in the setting sun. He had come to this forsaken plot of land seeking not peace, but an absence of war. He wanted to be left alone, to let the man he had been die of thirst in the desert of his memory. The weekly stagecoach kicked up a plume of that selfsame dust as it rattled into the one-street town of Redemption, a name that tasted like bitter irony on Caleb's tongue. He was in town for salt and flour, a trip he despised. The town meant people, and people meant questions. He was tying his mule to the hitching post outside the general store when he saw her. She stepped down from the coach, a small, slender figure in a world of broad shoulders and rough-hewn fabrics. She wore dark, simple trousers and a tunic of deep blue silk, a garment so out of place it might as well have been woven from moonlight. Her hair was a black, glossy river pulled back in a severe knot, and her face was a mask of calm, dignified neutrality. She held a single, small wooden chest. The town went silent. Men stopped their whittling, women paused their conversations, and every eye was fixed on the Chinese woman who stood alone in the center of their dusty world. Caleb felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. It couldn't be. He had answered the advertisement from a church circular. A desperate measure after a winter of sickness had proven his self-reliance had its limits. Hard-working widow seeks domestic position on quiet homestead, it had said. He'd corresponded with the preacher Williams, exchanging terse, practical letters. He needed a housekeeper, someone sturdy, plain, and quiet who would cook, clean, and otherwise remain invisible. He had sent the stagecoach fare. He had expected a Mrs. Gable, a woman described as godly and robust. He was not expecting this. This was not robust. This was delicate, and she was most certainly not the Mrs. Gable he had pictured. She saw him then. Her dark, almond-shaped eyes swept over the crowd and landed on him, the only man not openly gaping. There was a flicker of something in their depths. Assessment, perhaps, or maybe the same dawning horror he felt. She walked toward him, her steps measured and graceful, a stark contrast to the clumsy, sun-baked existence of everyone else. She stopped a few feet away and gave a slight, formal bow. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but clear, with a precise, almost musical cadence. "You are Mr. Thorne." Caleb didn't answer immediately. His mind was a maelstrom of anger and disbelief. The preacher had deceived him. Had he thought this was some kind of joke? Or worse, some misguided attempt at salvation for them both? He looked from her small, clean hands to the vast, brutal landscape that stretched out behind him. She would break here. The land would see to it. The sun would peel her like a piece of fruit. The wind would scour her to the bone, and the isolation would swallow her whole. He had built his life as a fortress, and this woman was a crack in the foundation. "There's been a mistake," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You're not who I was expecting." Her expression did not change, but a tension entered her stillness. "I am May Lynn. The arrangement was made by Preacher Williams, a place of shelter, in exchange for work." Her English was careful, deliberate. She chose her words like stones for crossing a river. "The arrangement was for a housekeeper," Caleb ground out, keeping his voice low to avoid the prying ears of the town. "A Mrs. Gable." Mrs. Gable took ill, May Lynn stated, a simple fact delivered without apology. The preacher said the need was urgent. He made a substitution. A substitution. He felt a surge of raw fury. He was not a shipment of goods. His life was not a ledger to be balanced by some do-goodin' preacher 1,000 miles away. "The stage leaves in the mornin'," he said, the words clipped and final. "You'll be on it." He turned to untie his mule, considering the matter closed. "I cannot," she said, her voice stopping him cold. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact, as unyielding as the bedrock beneath the dust. "The fare you sent was all I had. There is no money for a return journey, and nowhere to return to." He turned back slowly, taking in the sight of her again. The rigid set of her shoulders, the unwavering calm in her eyes. She was not begging. She was informing him of a predicament that was now, impossibly, his own. He was trapped. The town was watching, their judgment a palpable force. Leaving her stranded would make him a monster in their eyes, drawing exactly the kind of attention he had spent years avoiding. Taking her home felt like a surrender, a breach of the solitary peace he had fought so hard to build. He looked up at the sky. To the west, the horizon was darkening, the clouds piling up in bruised, angry shades of purple and gray. A storm was coming, a big one. The stage wouldn't be leaving in the morning. It wouldn't be leaving for days. He was stuck with her. Without another word, he grabbed her small chest, the wood surprisingly heavy, and slung it onto the back of the mule. He jerked his head toward the trail leading out of town. He didn't offer her a hand. He didn't offer her a word. He just started walking, the silence stretching between them, thicker and more ominous than the coming storm. The journey to the homestead was made in that same suffocating silence, broken only by the plodding of the mule and the rising moan of the wind. May Lynn walked behind him, her stride surprisingly steady and untiring for someone he had judged so fragile. She did not complain about the dust or the distance. She did not speak at all. When they finally crested the last rise and the cabin came into view, a dark shape huddled against the vast emptiness, she paused for a fraction of a second. Caleb glanced back, catching the briefest flicker of something on her face. Not fear, but a deep, profound weariness, as if this desolate place was just the final stop on a long, hard road. He felt a nettle of something uncomfortable, something that might have been pity if he were a man who allowed such useless emotions. The storm broke just as they reached the cabin, the sky opening up with a roar. Rain came down in solid, blinding sheets, turning the dust to a thick, clinging mud. Inside, the cabin was small and Spartan. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by shelves holding a few books and tin plates. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot, and his own larger bedstead filled the rest of the space. It was a place built for one man's existence, and her presence immediately made it feel impossibly crowded. He dropped her chest by the door with a thud. "You can have the cot," he grunted, not looking at her. He moved to the fireplace, his focus on the practical, the necessary. Building a fire, shutting out the world. He expected tears, or perhaps a panicked outburst. He got neither. Mei Lin surveyed the room with that unnerving calm, her gaze taking in the dusty corners, the disorganized stack of cooking pots, the general air of masculine neglect. Then she removed her outer layer, revealing the simple, practical clothing beneath. She walked to the water barrel, ladled some into a basin, and began to wash the dust of the trail from her face and hands with methodical grace. Her quiet competence was an accusation. It highlighted his own disarray, the ways in which his solitude had allowed him to let things slide. Over the next few days, the storm raged, locking them inside the small cabin, a universe of 2 strangers bound by 4 walls. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and rain hammered on the roof in a relentless tattoo. For Caleb, it was a special kind of hell. He was used to space, to the open sky. Being confined with her, with this silent, observant woman, made his skin crawl. He tried to ignore her, busying himself with mending a saddle harness, a complex task that required focus and precision. The leather was old and stiff, the needle thick and unwieldy. He worked by the firelight, his large hands fumbling in the intricate places. He set the harness down in frustration, the stitching uneven and clumsy. He had to go check on the mule. When he returned, soaked and steaming in the firelight, the harness was on the table. He picked it up. A section of it had been restitched. The thread ran in a perfect, tight line, each stitch identical to the last, stronger and cleaner than any work he could have done himself. He looked at Mei Lin. She was sitting by the fire, sharpening one of his kitchen knives on a whetstone, her movements fluid and economical. She didn't look up. She didn't claim credit. She had simply seen a task that needed doing and done it better than he could. The first crack appeared in the wall of his certainty. That evening, he tossed her a slab of salted bacon and half an onion, the sum of his culinary ambition. "Food," he grunted. It was a challenge, a test. "Let's see what you can do with nothing." He watched from the corner of his eye as she took the meager offerings. She found a handful of withered potatoes in his nearly empty stores and a small bag of rice in her own chest. She moved about the small cooking area with an unhurried, deliberate grace. The air, which usually smelled of wood smoke and damp wool, began to fill with an aroma that made his stomach clench with a hunger he hadn't realized he possessed. It was the scent of fried onion, of sizzling bacon, and something else, something savory and foreign he couldn't name. She served him a bowl of rice mixed with the finely chopped ingredients, a meal transformed from a punishment into something delicious. It was the best food he had eaten in years. He ate in silence, the storm outside a distant echo to the turmoil inside him. He had wanted her to fail. He had wanted to prove that she was a liability, a fragile piece of porcelain that had no place in his world. Instead, she was proven to be resilient, resourceful, and unnervingly capable. She wasn't just surviving in his space, she was improving it. The cabin was cleaner. The tools were organized. There was a quiet order emerging from his bachelor chaos, an order he hadn't even known was missing. A fragile truce settled between them as the storm abated and the sun returned, baking the mud into a cracked, hard shell. They still rarely spoke, but their silence began to change. It was less of a hostile wall and more of a shared space. He would go out to work the land, clearing rocks from a field he hoped to one day plant, and he would return to find a hot meal waiting and a pot of clean water drawn from the well. He watched her. He saw how she moved with a dancer's balance and a startling awareness of her surroundings. He saw the way she tended to the small patch of earth beside the cabin, coaxing a few stubborn green shoots from the soil where she had planted herbs from her own small store. He saw her hands, which he had first judged as soft and useless. They were slender, yes, but they were also deft and strong, as capable with a needle as they were with a knife. His grudging respect grew, a slow, unwelcome vine curling around his heart. He began to see not the outsider, the woman, the liability, but a person. A person as solitary in her own way as he was. He discovered she could read. He had a few worn books on his shelf, manuals on farming, a book of poetry he never touched, and a thick, dry volume on territorial law he'd acquired in a trade and never opened. One evening, he saw her tracing the words in the law book, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You can read English," he stated, the words coming out sounding more like an accusation than a question. "Yes," she replied, not looking up. "My father was a scholar. He believed knowledge was a shield." A shield against what? He wondered. He began to leave the book out for her intentionally. He was a man defined by his solitude, yet he found himself growing accustomed to her quiet presence. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was occupied. This realization was more unsettling than any storm. He was changing, and he didn't know how to stop it. He was beginning to think of the homestead not as his, but, in some small, terrifying way, as theirs. The day Silas Blackwood rode up, the sky was a merciless, cloudless blue. Caleb saw the dust cloud from a mile off, and his hand instinctively went to the worn grip of the pistol tucked into his waistband. He had known this was coming. Blackwood was a vulture in a tailored suit, a man who had gotten rich by buying up land from desperate men and squeezing them until they bled. He owned the town, the bank, and half the county, but he didn't own Caleb's spring, the only reliable source of water for 10 miles in any direction. Blackwood arrived with 2 of his hired guns, men with dead eyes and cruel mouths who looked at Caleb's small homestead with undisguised contempt. Blackwood himself remained mounted on a magnificent black stallion, looking down on Caleb as if he were something he'd scraped off his boot. "Thorne," he said, his voice smooth and cold as a river stone, "I've come to make you a final offer, a generous one, enough to get you far away from here." "Not interested," Caleb said, his voice flat. He stood on his porch, his body relaxed but coiled, a predator at rest. Blackwood's gaze slid past Caleb to the cabin door, where Mei Lin had appeared, silent and watchful. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, now, look at this. I didn't realize you'd acquired company. I'm surprised you'd bring something so exotic way out here. Does she have a name?" His tone was thick with insinuation, and his men snickered. A red haze descended over Caleb's vision. Every instinct screamed at him to draw, to wipe the smirk off Blackwood's face with a bullet. But that would be the end of this life, the end of the quiet he had so desperately sought. It would mean running again, and he was tired of running. He held his ground, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. You and your men will get off my land. Now." The shift in him was palpable. The simple homesteader vanished, and for a fleeting second, the man he used to be stood in his place. Blackwood's men shifted uneasily in their saddles. They were thugs, not fools. They recognized a killer when they saw one. Blackwood's smile tightened. "Have it your way, squatter, but understand this. That spring will be mine. This land will be mine, and you will be gone, one way or another." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men trailing behind him like jackals. Caleb stood there for a long time, the rage simmering just beneath his skin. The threat had been made public. Blackwood had not only threatened his home, but he had insulted Mei Lin, drawing her into his violent world. He had tried to build a wall between his past and his present, but Blackwood had just kicked a hole right through it. He turned and saw Mei Lin still standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dark and steady. She had heard the threat. She had seen the man he truly was, the violence he kept leashed inside him. He expected her to be afraid. He expected her to finally break. "They will come back," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he answered. She nodded once, a gesture of grim acceptance, and went back inside the cabin. The conversation was over. They both knew what was coming. The fragile peace was shattered. Now, they were just waiting for the war. The attack came 3 nights later, under the sliver of a dead moon. There was no warning, just the sudden, frantic cawing of the chickens, a sound of pure terror in the dead of night. Caleb was awake instantly, rolling from his bed with the pistol already in his hand. He moved to the window, a shadow among shadows, and peered out. 3 figures were creeping toward the barn, carrying torches. Fire. Blackwood wasn't just trying to scare him, he was trying to erase him, to burn him out root and stem. "Stay inside," he hissed to Mei Lin, who was already up, her face a pale oval in the darkness. "Bar the door, and don't open it for anyone but me." He didn't wait for a reply. He slipped out the back of the cabin and melted into the familiar darkness of his own land. The air was cold and still, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the acrid smell of the oil-soaked torches. He was in his element now. This was a language he understood better than words. He circled around, silent as a hunting cat, using the rocks and sparse brush for cover. The first man went down without a sound. Caleb came up behind him, a ghost in the night, and a single, brutal strike with the butt of his pistol sent the man to the ground, unconscious. He took the man's rifle. 2 left. They were by the barn now, about to set the dry timber alight. He raised the rifle, the metal cold against his cheek. He could end this. 2 shots, 2 dead men. The thought was as easy and natural as breathing. It was the old way, the Cain way. But he wasn't Cain anymore. He was Caleb Thorne, a homesteader. He aimed for the torch, not the man. The rifle cracked, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent night. The torch exploded in a shower of sparks, and the man holding it screamed, dropping it and clutching his hand. The third man spun around, firing blindly into the darkness. Caleb dropped flat, bullets whining over his head, kicking up spurts of dust. He was pinned. The second man, the one with the burned hand, recovered his senses and scrambled for cover, drawing his own pistol. Now it was 2 against 1. The odds were still in his favor, but it was getting complicated. He heard a noise from behind him, a soft footfall. His blood ran cold. One of them had gotten around him. He rolled, bringing his pistol up, ready to fire, and froze. It was Mei Lin. She was holding his other pistol, the old peacemaker he kept in a trunk, a relic of his past he could never bring himself to get rid of. Her face was set, her eyes wide in the gloom, but her hands were rock steady. "I told you to stay inside," he snarled, a whisper of pure fury. She ignored him, her gaze fixed on the two men who were now advancing on their position. Two men, one in front, one to the left, behind the rocks. Her voice was a low, calm whisper, an impossibly serene tactical assessment in the middle of a gunfight. Before he could argue, the man behind the rocks made his move. He rose up, leveling his pistol right at Caleb's exposed position. Caleb reacted instantly, but he knew he was a fraction of a second too late. The world seemed to slow down. He saw the flash of the man's gun, heard the deafening roar, and then another sound, a sharp, flat crack right next to his ear. The man behind the rocks jerked as if struck by lightning, his pistol flying from his hand as he screamed and collapsed, clutching a shattered wrist. Caleb stared, dumbfounded. The shot had come from Mei Lin. It was an impossible shot. In the dark, at that distance, with a heavy, unfamiliar weapon, it wasn't just accurate, it was perfect, disabling without killing. The remaining attacker, stunned by the sudden turn of events, hesitated. That was all Caleb needed. He broke from cover, a charging shadow, and subdued the man with a ferocity that left no room for resistance. The fight was over. Silence descended again, thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. The two hired guns were trussed up, one unconscious, one whimpering in pain. Caleb stood, breathing heavily, and looked at Mei Lin. She was still holding the peacemaker, the barrel smoking slightly in the cold night air. She hadn't just saved his life. She had done it with a skill that he, of all people, knew was not learned. It was innate. It was the mark of a master. The quiet, delicate woman he had seen as a liability was something else entirely. The foundation of his world had not just been cracked, it had been pulverized. They were no longer a man and his unwanted housekeeper. They were partners, forged in the crucible of a shared crisis. The next morning, Caleb knew he could no longer wait for the war to come to him. He had to take it to Blackwood. He loaded the two captured men, bound and gagged, into his small wagon. "We're going to town," he said to Mei Lin. It wasn't a question. He couldn't leave her here alone. Not anymore. She simply nodded, retrieved her own small bundle, and climbed onto the wagon seat beside him. The journey was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled with the deafening thunder of unspoken questions. Sheriff Brody was a man who looked as worn down as the town he was paid to protect. His office was a small, dusty room that smelled of stale coffee and regret. He looked at the two battered men Caleb dumped on his floor, then at Caleb, then at the small, silent Chinese woman standing beside him. "Thorne," he sighed, rubbing his face. "What in God's name am I supposed to do with this?" "That's Blackwood's trash," Caleb said, his voice cold. "They tried to burn me out last night. This is my sworn complaint. I want him arrested." Brody let out a short, bitter laugh. "Arrest Silas Blackwood? Son, he owns the judge, the mayor, and probably the damn church steeple. My badge is just a piece of tin he lets me wear. I can't touch him." He gestured to a stack of papers on his desk. "I'm just one man. Look at this. Robberies, disputes, a pile of official notices from the Capitol, and these." He tapped a stack of wanted posters. "Fresh batch from the territorial marshal. More trouble than I can handle." It was then that Mei Lin, who had been standing quietly by the wall, took a half step forward. Her eyes were fixed on the posters. Caleb followed her gaze. His heart stopped. On the top of the pile was a poster, the ink still fresh. The drawing was a crude but recognizable likeness of himself from 10 years ago. Beneath it, the name read, Kane, the ghost of Caldera, wanted for murder, $5,000. The air left Caleb's lungs. His past, the one he had buried so deep, was here, in this room. Sheriff Brody hadn't seen it yet, but he would. It was over. He felt a strange sense of resignation. But then he saw Maylin's hand, a small, subtle movement, as she reached out as if to steady herself against the wall, and in that one fluid motion, she shifted a different stack of papers, covering the poster of Kane with a mundane notice about livestock brands. It was so quick, so deliberate, that neither he nor Brody seemed to register it as anything other than an accidental shuffle. His eyes met hers, and in that moment he saw that her gaze was not on the poster of him, but on one underneath it, an older, more weathered poster that her movement had partially uncovered. It was from a different territory, years old, the paper yellowed and creased. The sketch was of a figure in shadows, almost impossible to make out, but the name was one Caleb had heard whispered in saloons and around campfires years ago, a legend from the sprawling, corrupt cities of the West Coast. The Silk Viper, it read, wanted for the assassination of a syndicate chief, $10,000. He looked from the name on the poster to the quiet, dignified woman standing before him. The Silk Viper, a ghost, a legend, an assassin known for impossible speed and for killing only the most powerful and corrupt men. A figure who had vanished without a trace years ago. He looked at her steady hands. He remembered the impossible shot in the dark. He remembered her unnerving calm, her quiet competence that bordered on perfection. He remembered her father, the scholar who had taught her that knowledge was a shield. Perhaps he had taught her other things as well. A universe of understanding passed between them in that single, silent glance. The great unmasking. He was Kane, the gunslinger who had fought on the losing side of a brutal range war and been branded a murderer for it. She was the Silk Viper, an avenger who had dispensed her own form of justice and been branded an assassin. They were both fugitives, both running from a past that refused to stay buried, both seeking a sanctuary they were beginning to realize they could only find in each other. The lie of their arrangement had been burned away, leaving a raw, staggering truth. "Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice changed, harder now, imbued with a new and terrible certainty. "You're going to stay in this office for the next hour. You're going to be very busy with your paperwork. When you're done, you're going to ride out to my homestead. You'll find evidence of an unprovoked attack. You'll find Silas Blackwood responsible." He put his hand on the butt of his pistol. It was not a threat. It was a promise. Sheriff Brody, a man who knew how to recognize a force of nature when he saw one, looked from Caleb's eyes to Maylin's, and slowly he nodded. They walked out into the harsh sunlight, no longer just a man and a woman, but two legends walking side by side. Blackwood, enraged that his men hadn't returned, was riding out to finish the job himself. They met him and his 4 remaining gunmen on the open plain, halfway between the town and the homestead. There were no words. Blackwood saw the look on Caleb's face and knew the game was over. He and his men went for their guns. What followed was not a fight. It was an execution. Caleb moved with the brutal efficiency of a wolf, his shots powerful and deliberate, taking down 2 men before they had a clear target. He used the wagon for cover, drawing their fire, a tactical anchor in the chaos. But it was Maylin who was the true revelation. She stood in the open, a still point in the storm, the peacemaker in her hand a blur of motion. She fired 4 times. The sounds were so close together they were almost a single report. Blackwood and his remaining men crumpled, not dead, but systematically disabled. A shattered kneecap, a ruined shoulder, a pistol shot from a man's hand. It was a display of marksmanship so profound it bordered on the supernatural. It was over in less than 10 seconds. When Sheriff Brody arrived an hour later, as promised, he found Blackwood and his men bound and bleeding, their power utterly broken. He saw the evidence of the fight, looked at the quiet homesteader and the even quieter Chinese woman, and made a decision. The official report would read that Silas Blackwood and his associates were arrested while resisting a lawful investigation, brought on by Thorne's complaint. The wanted poster for Kane was, as Brody later told his deputy, tragically lost in a gust of wind. Back at the cabin, the air was still and thick with the aftertaste of violence. Caleb had a deep gash along his forearm, a parting gift from one of Blackwood's men. He sat at the table while Mei Lin cleaned the wound. Her touch was gentle but firm, her movements precise as she stitched the skin together with a needle and thread she had sterilized in boiling water. He watched her face, illuminated by the lantern light. He saw the concentration in her dark eyes, the steady set of her jaw. He saw not the assassin, not the legend, but the woman, the survivor, the other half of his own broken soul. When she was finished, he reached out with his good hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. It was the first time he had ever touched her with simple tenderness. Her eyes met his, and in their depths he saw the reflection of his own weary, battered hope. The war was over. Weeks bled into a month. The raw, violent memories of the confrontation began to fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of a shared life. The gashes on Caleb's arm healed into a pale scar, a permanent reminder of the day everything changed. Blackwood was gone, his empire crumbling under the weight of federal investigations that Sheriff Brody had, with some anonymous encouragement, initiated. The town of Redemption began to look at Caleb Thorne and the mysterious woman at his side with a new kind of respect, tinged with a healthy dose of fear. The gossip died down, replaced by a wary acceptance. They were left alone. The homestead began to transform. The cabin, once a mere shelter, started to feel like a home. Mei Lin's herbs grew in neat, fragrant rows beside the porch. The interior was clean and orderly, brightened by a colorful piece of silk she had hung on one of the rough-hewn walls. The silence between them was no longer a chasm of unspoken tensions, but a comfortable blanket of shared understanding. They still spoke little, but they no longer needed to. They communicated in the easy cadence of their work, in the passing of a tool, and a shared glance across the dinner table. One cool morning, they worked together in the small plot of land Caleb had cleared. He had finally bought a proper plow, and he turned the dark, rich earth near the spring while she followed behind, carefully dropping seeds into the furrows. He dug the hard earth, his strength making the difficult work look easy. She planted the seeds for corn, beans, and squash, her slender fingers pressing each one into the soil with a reverence that was almost prayer-like. It was a simple, symbolic act, a silent pact with the land and with each other. They were no longer just surviving on this patch of earth, they were cultivating it. They were putting down roots together. He would watch her as she worked, her movements as graceful and deliberate as ever, and a feeling he couldn't name, a warm, quiet thing, would settle in his chest. It felt like peace. That evening, they sat on the porch steps, a ritual they had developed without ever discussing it. They watched the sun bleed across the horizon, painting the vast empty sky in hues of orange, pink, and deep violet. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and sage. For a long time, neither of them spoke, simply sharing the profound beauty of the twilight. The quiet was full and alive, a testament to everything they had survived. Caleb finally broke the silence, his voice low and rough, but stripped of its former harshness. He wasn't looking at her, but out at the land, at the dark line of the mesas against the fading light. "This land," he said, the words feeling heavy and important in his mouth. "It's ours now." Mei Lin turned her head to look at him. A small, genuine smile, the first he had ever truly seen from her, touched the corners of her lips, illuminating her face in the dying light. It was a thing of breathtaking beauty. "Our home," she replied, her voice soft but certain. He gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't a passionate declaration. It was not a promise of love whispered in the dark. It was something more solid, more real. It was a statement of fact, a foundation stone laid for a future they would build together. Here, on this small patch of unforgiving land, two fugitives, a gunslinger and an assassin, had finally stopped running. They had found their sanctuary, not in a place, but in the quiet, resilient space they had carved out between them. They had found their redemption not in a town, but in each other.